My name is Ali. I'm a regional ethicist with the Champlain Center for Healthcare Ethics. And we're going to be talking today about decisions that surround nutrition closer to the end of an individual's life. Some of the objectives that we have for today's session is to sort of explore why and how some of these conflicts arise, right? Where does the issue come from? And after that, we'll look at kind of the ethical angle, right? So what is different about the situation? What makes it a little bit morally challenging sometimes? And then hopefully we'll wrap up by discussing some strategies that might help you. And throughout the presentation, we'll have a couple of scenarios for you to think on as we're talking through today's content that can hopefully be a point of reflection. So starting with that, I urge you to sort of think about some of the values and principles that come up in your mind as we talk about this case. And then I'll ask you guys to give some of those responses. So let's imagine we're talking about this individual named Jim. Jim is your patient, and he suffered a major heart attack that has left him in end-stage congestive heart failure, chronic renal insufficiency, and has agitated his COPD. He receives nutrition and hydration through a gastronomy tube and lives in a long-term care facility. His wife says Jim never wanted to be dependent on others. Can't you just let him die in peace? After you have a deeper discussion with the family, you agree to transition Jim to a palliative care approach. But you have a difficult time deciding if you should withdraw his nutrition. So that's the question kind of posed to you. In this case, what should you do? Should you withdraw the nutrition? His wife was pretty clear about what his wishes were. Let's leave it, it's a delicate subject and we don't want to complicate the situation more than it needs to be. Or, the third option, which is also very valid, which I'm not sure. I'll give you guys a few seconds to throw that in there. And as you're submitting that, I'd kind of urge you guys to think about some of the values that come up for you as you're thinking about these, right? So ethical principles you may have heard in the past, personal ideas and values that kind of come up. Love for you to brainstorm that. Here we are. Yeah. So I think this is a really interesting split here where I think we have about 50% of the audience saying that it should be withdrawn because his wife was clear about his wishes, and another, good chunk of the group not sure about what to do. And I think that that's entirely reasonable to sort of end up at this split because we're talking about a situation where we feel like we maybe know the wishes that have been shared with respect to the patient that we're trying to provide care for. But at the same time, there seems to be some ambiguity around, what really should we be doing? How far should we be reaching on this situation? All right, so that's interesting to see. And I think we'll revisit this case a little bit later, and hopefully through today's, the different slides that we go through, it'll help you guys come up with different understanding, and we'll see what the responses are at that point. But I would love to see, in the chat, any values that come to mind about in your experiences when you've had discussions with family members or with patients, or you find yourself in a therapeutic environment where discussions about nutrition at the end of life are occurring. What are some of those themes that come up, right? I think one that I hear often is autonomy, right? What are the rights of the individual patient or person or resident, depending on the space you provide care in? What are their wants? I think some of the other values that we do see come up is in line with autonomy. Is autonomy always individualistic, or is it a little bit more family centered? Right. So give it a few more minutes, maybe, or seconds rather, for chat to populate. But in the meantime, I think these are some values that we see, and we sent out some surveys, I think, from the previous Dining to Learn sessions, and these were some of the responses that we heard come up. I think somebody said, speak up. Right. If there's an audio issue, please throw that in the chat as well. I'll try to speak a little bit louder. Hopefully everybody else has been able to hear me. But some of the values that we see that do complicate a lot of these discussions rotate around this idea of sometimes futility or the reality of a situation. What are we really facing? What are the issues that we're up against? What falls within a standard of care approach? Is it reasonable to provide artificial nutrition at the end of a life for patients? How do you have those conversations? Sometimes quality of life comes up as another as another issue, as a huge value laden concept that impacts whether or not one person in the same situation as another person will choose to accept different interventions at their end of life. Autonomy and capacity, I think, is like in all, I think, healthcare issues, one of the most complicating factors for these sort of discussions, because if you're faced with an issue where you're not sure about the capacity of the individual, or you find that they're lacking capacity to make that decision, how do you best value their autonomy? And the understanding that I think we have is you look to a substitute decision maker, right? So those all, I think, come together, the different family perspectives, the different dynamics, all in different ways, I think, contribute to the complexity of the issue that we see. Now, if we ask ourselves a deeper question about why does this conflict arise, it seems like a very universal concept. And I don't think it's much of a stretch to say, and I think, hopefully you will agree that food is kind of a love language. And, while we may all not speak the same language, I think food is one of those things that really does go beyond cultures and different understandings to be this idea of, if I want to show somebody love and I want to show somebody care, I'm going to give them food, right? And in lots of different contexts, I think you see that with parents feeding their children, or partners going out and cooking for one another, or even just family members caring for one another, friends cooking for each other. You have Thanksgiving, you have Friendsgivings, you have lots of different social and, I think, different forms of communication and care that exists through food. And when you find somebody at a very difficult and emotional stage in their life, right? Again, we're talking about end of life care. This, a lot of newsflash, it's a very difficult time for most people to be going through. And in that time of care, that time of need, giving somebody food is sometimes what caregivers feel is the least they can do. So it sometimes becomes this idea of, this is the only way I can provide you love. This is the only way I can show you that I care. And I think it is very beautiful that this exists, but I think that very much that beauty in its own way is what creates the difficulty to have a lot of these discussions and makes it such a polarizing topic. Some of the other, I think, common themes that we have seen, from responses from the group and in general, is that barriers to communication can be a huge reason as to why these problems arise. And that's not just communication because of uh, you know, issues with translation and language, but just because of the idea of the sensitivity of the nature of death, how taboo it kind of is within all cultures, or a lot of cultures at least. There's a lack of comfort, I think, that people have when talking about issues that surround death or that surround the end of life. And I'm sure that, some of you may be able to relate with the fact that you may be providing care to people near the end of their lives, and it's coming. And everybody knows it's coming, but nobody talks about the fact that it's coming. But it becomes a very difficult thing to talk about. And not to lay a judgment on whether or not that is appropriate or inappropriate, but more so as an observation, is that that creates a communication barrier. So communication isn't just because of languages and cultures that we come from, but it's also because of universal taboos that we might have around these issues. Another common theme that I'm sure doesn't surprise many of you is the perspectives of substitute decision makers as part of the circle of care. Oftentimes, a lot of the issues that we see, we find to be more complicated by the involvement of an SDM, which I think is a very interesting perspective to have on this issue. The role of the SDM, we view, I think, as a role to support us through making a decision that would empower the autonomy of the individual. However, what I think happens is, a lot of the times, because as care providers, we're so used to seeing a lot of these issues and a lot of these cases that seem to be very similar, but for the individuals that we're interacting with are very novel, it creates this space of conflict where the SDM's perspective, we seem to find ourselves having the same conversations over and over again. And the perspective of the SDM becomes a really difficult hurdle to cross, because we know that it's coming. We know that it's very similar. We know, and we hopefully believe in many situations, that it comes from a genuine place, but nonetheless, it complicates the matter. It makes it a little bit more difficult. And that's not to say that it's a bad thing to have those SDMs as part of the discussion, but more of idea to highlight and identify these. This is one of the themes that makes this a difficult conversation or difficult topic to, I think, address. Education or lack of understanding, I think, also stems from that, not just from the perspective of the SDM, but even a lack of education, understanding from our perspective as care providers, that we may not know what the best approach would be to have. The reason we're here today is to talk about some of those, and come up with maybe some strategies and hopefully some helpful tips that you can take away from today's seminar. But a lack of education goes both ways. I think oftentimes we assume, when we hear that there's a lack of education that's complicating the relationship, we think that it's because the SDMs or the patients may not be as medically informed as we are. But I think that there's also an onus of accepting that that lack of education understanding can come from the healthcare provider's perspective. And I think lastly, but not leastly, definitely, is cultural sensitivities. I think we are very fortunate to live in a country like Canada, where there's a lot of representation of people of diverse cultures and backgrounds. And I think that that creates a beautiful tapestry of just human expression and identities. But it adds a layer of complexity when dealing with issues, because it may be the same issue. It feels like the facts are similar across two different people, but the backgrounds and experiences that have led them to that place can be very different and can impact the way that they make decisions. And I think in that context, we lead to the next slide, is these divergent worldviews. I think all of these different common themes, we can break it down into this idea of what is a divergent worldview, or the fact that we have divergent worldviews. And that's not a bad thing. So what that means is that there's more than just one way to see a problem, to address a problem, and to deal with a problem. People can have the same motivations, but act in very different ways. And this is another sort of thought experiment or idea to share with you. So let's take this example of these two individuals, Anna and Eric. Anna and Eric are members of the community. They're both very concerned with food security and availability of food for people that they feel are vulnerable members of society or of their community. They both decide that they want to do something about this issue in their local community. Anna decides that she wants to take a behind the scenes global approach to the work, where she works with local businesses to make sure that, there's donations coming into the food bank, working with, restaurants to make sure that leftovers don't get thrown out and they get brought to the food bank. Whereas Eric opts to volunteer more on the front lines of the food bank, making sure that he's there at the front line, making sure people, in line get the food, that they're able to receive the food that they need, helps to raise awareness about the availability of the food banks and its offerings. So both of these individuals are providing some sort of assistance in this space. They have the same motivations, but they act in two very different ways. Now, this is kind of, I think, a personal question. I hope you guys will answer as honestly as you feel. But who did it better? Did Anna? Did Eric? Or did they both kind of do a good job? Get no wrong answers. But I think it's a good question to think about. And I think that we see this exist in a lot of different spaces as well, right? I think in a political space, we see this as well. If we look at, the race for prime minister, both candidates, all candidates rather, want what's good for Canada in some way, right? They run on that platform of, we want to help this country, but they have very different ways of actioning that. There's very different ideas about what is going to be good for the country, right? I think that's something that we see all over the world, right? In Paris, in the US, just really everywhere. You have individuals that act in what seem like, sometimes very different ways, diametrically opposing worldviews, but still claim to have the same motivation. And I think that that's the idea that I want everybody to take away from here. So if we have the results, I'd love to see what people said. And yeah, I think we have an overwhelming understanding that, both of these individuals, did quote unquote a very good job, or created, acted very ethically, let's say. Right. So I think that the point I'm trying to draw from this is, when we look at substitute decision makers getting involved and the problems seem to get worse and more complicated, doesn't necessarily mean that the SDM is acting inappropriately. The goals of care, or the ideas of care that we may come with into a space to provide care, to a person, that might find themselves in a long-term care space or might find themselves in a hospital bed or whatever environment of care that you work within, you come at them hopefully with this idea of what we call beneficence, this idea of doing good. It's quite I think, a core feature or principle of providing healthcare to people is that you try to do good for them. In that similar vein, when their family members are getting involved, I think it's a pretty good idea to think that they're being involved for that very same reason. However, we find ourselves misaligning our goals with the SDMs. We find ourselves at conflict, right? So I think one of the things to take away from this is that we owe an air of understanding to SDMs that, you're here to do what you understand to be the best. And what I understand to be the best option is very different. And it might be because of different experiences, different cultural backgrounds. It could be a variety of reasons that make that sort of worldview feel very divergent, even though at the core of that situation, you both want the same thing, which is some form of benefit for the individual you're looking to provide care for. And I think that if that is something that you can ascertain is happening, because that's not to say that there aren't SDMs that act maliciously. That definitely does happen, right? And I think that with the clinical experience that you have, with the the issues that you see, you're able to pick out sometimes when you're like, hey, this SDM's acting a little bit unorthodox, or there's something shady happening here, versus this is just a really difficult situation. The family's not understanding, and it's frustrating. But I think understanding that they may have the same motivation as you makes it easier, I think, to understand how we can address the situation. So really just to elucidate that, I think, more explicitly. I think a lot of the times SDMs also feel a huge weight to make this right decision, right? This huge idea of I cannot make a mistake. I've been tasked not only to make a decision about this person's healthcare, but now we're talking about end of life things. I don't want to be the reason they die. I don't want to be the one to make the wrong decision. I don't want to live with that guilt. We've had, I've had conversations with family members that have reached out to us for support or have, it feels, I think, from one perspective, you could say you're creating a huge issue with the care team. But at the end of the day, when we sit down and sometimes have those discussions, what happens to be the message at the end of the day from the SDM is, I just wanted to make sure I tried everything. I don't want to live with the guilt of not having done everything that I could for my father. Right. And I think that that is a huge weight. And it's difficult, I think, rightfully so, for healthcare providers to sometimes see that because, for us, it might be a daily occurrence. It might be a very common occurrence, but for these individuals, it's not. So they have these huge pressures to make what to them feels like the right decision when oftentimes there is no right decision. You just have a really bad decision and a less bad decision. Sometimes you're just picking between two not so great options. And I think being able to understand, if we understand that, I think we can provide better support to the individuals going through that decision-making process. Now, some ways that the same concerns can be seen from different perspectives, and I think is really well demonstrated by this table, right? If we look at, for example, the concern of emotional support from a patient's perspective, they feel like they need support, understanding through what to them would be, potentially a very traumatic time with their illness. Whereas the substitute decision maker, from their perspective, emotional support might be something they need to be giving to somebody else while themselves needing it. Right. So I think a lot of these concerns about principles that we understand to apply into specific cases have very different understandings based on who the person of interest we're looking at is. And I think autonomy provides a great idea of this, autonomy being that idea of an individual's right to govern their own care. From a substitute decision maker's perspective, you may not always know what that patient or that individual would have wanted. But because they might be somebody close to them, they might be somebody that knows them, they're able to better elucidate what they would have done were they in that situation. So it comes with, well, I don't know what this person wants themselves for sure, but I know who they were, and I maybe know what's good for them. And so I'm going to further provide consent or deny consent or advocate for this sort of treatment for them or advocate for that sort of treatment for them in an effort to try to advance their autonomy. Whereas from a patient perspective, that's a very easy thing to do because, hey, I'm guiding the care. I'm able to give my own input, right? So I think, if you guys have some time, want to go through these slides later, I think this is a great slide to spend some time on and differentiate some of those perspectives. But how do we address the ethics, right? How do we talk about these difficult value-laden concepts in ways that we may be able to better understand? So another poll for everybody here that asks, an action is ethical if or when it maximizes good outcomes, or if it follows a set of rules and principles, or is an action ethical if it follows local laws and policies?
Great, I'll share the results here.
Perfect. Thank you, Carl. I think we have a very interesting split here with about 50% of responses coming as an action is ethical if it maximizes good outcomes versus we have about 40% here who believe that if it follows a set of rules or principles, then it's appropriate. And I think, C is very similar to B in that same idea of it follows local laws and policies. So I think we have another 50-50 split here, which I think is quite interesting. And some of these ideas you may have been familiar with. We'll try not to get too philosophical here so I don't put you guys to sleep, but we'll get into some of these ideas over the next few slides. This quote, I think, is especially a nice quote. I think it resonates with me. Is talks about the key to a quality of life or kind of to an ethical approach is doing the right thing for the right reasons in the right way. And so it highlights three different points of action that kind of come together to give you an idea of, if you're doing things with this sort of intention, with this reasoning, and in a particular way, then it's likely to be kind of a better outcome or understood to be, at least in this context, the key to quality of life. Now, as we've seen with this poll, there's a lot of opinions on what makes an action right or ethical, right? So if we look at option A here, where we talk about it maximizes the good outcomes, this is called consequentialism or utilitarianism, which is this idea that you're able to value an action based on its positive impacts and its negative impacts. And if it has a whole bunch of positive impacts, then we can definitely move forward with it and it would be a great thing to do. It sounds like an amazing way to, I think, approach things. I think people who believe otherwise would say, well, if you have 5 people that are sick in a hospital and you have one really healthy person and all 5 of those people need a different organ, can you take that one healthy person and give their organs to the other 5? You would save 5 lives. That would be a net positive. That would be a net benefit. But is that really enough to make that act ethical? Versus the idea of, actions are ethical if or when they follow a set of rules. So you would say that no, you can't harm somebody's autonomy. You can't do this. You can't do that. You have to create rules and regulations on how we're supposed to act. But in that same vein, that seems like a solution. But is it really? If we say universally, we should never lie. We should never tell a lie. But, you're home one day, your friend comes knocking on the door, they're freaking out. They're like, there's a murderer after me. You need to hide me in your house. And you're like, yeah, of course, get in here. And then, a second later, this guy knocks at your door. Is like, hey, is Greg there? Just looking for Greg. And Greg is in your house. Do you tell the truth? Do you follow a rigid set of principles and rules? Maybe not. Right. So is there ever really a perfect answer to this? And I think the answer is no. But I think being ethical requires us to kind of be open-minded, to understand that some of these ideas can be helpful in broad strokes and in broad spaces. But when we're looking at specific issues, we need to consider the context of that dilemma, the context of the space that we're in, and the variety of different issues that might be present in order to sort of understand what might be the best thing to do. And an example I like to give of this is the principle of autonomy, which again, that idea that we have the right to govern our own bodies and our own healthcare, against the idea of relational autonomy. Now, if I am an autonomous person, I should be able to go and do whatever I want, right? The weather's beautiful. It's been beautiful all day. Why am I sitting here? Why am I not outside enjoying the sun? or it's been cold for the last couple of weeks or months or for way too long. How come I'm still in Ottawa dealing with the cold instead of flying off to Cuba? I could do that. What's stopping me? Why don't I do that? I have responsibilities. I have people that I can't leave. I have a wonderful group of people sitting here this evening today to talk about this complex issue that I want to spend time with. I have other desires, other needs, other responsibilities, things that I've willingly committed myself to that limit my ability to do what I want. So is autonomy really just an individually self-serving thing, or is it more relational in its approach? Do people make decisions based on what they only want or because of what is around them? So if we look at individuals who may have, who may suffer with cancer and decide, what, I'm going to go through with chemo. It's going to be brutal, it's going to be difficult, and it's not going to cure me. But it's going to give me an extra few months, and I'm going to be able to spend that time with my family. That's a decision that individual is making of their own accord, but for others. It's a relational decision. So, can you really understand any one particular value to point you to one answer? I think the answer to that is no. And that's why I think we need to kind of come at a lot of these issues with an ethical understanding or an ethical lens to be able to differentiate what makes this one approach different from this other approach, what makes this one action different from another action. And that's why I think this quote that we talked about earlier is doing the right thing in the right way for the right reasons is one way that it helps us to elucidate that. Now, to drive this point home with a little bit more clarity is if we look at different ideas of care that are provided at the end of life. So if we look at palliative sedation versus medical assistance in dying versus the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments. If we look at the intention, the methods, the motivation, and the outcome, we see some key differences. So the intention of palliative sedation is to reduce suffering caused by medical condition. In MAID, it's similar, but it's a little bit different. It's to end the suffering caused by a medical condition. And with withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments, again, it's kind of similar, but there's a little bit of a difference. And what is that difference? It's to stop any interventions that are prolonging that person's life. So the intentions of each of those three treatment options is very different, as is their method. Excuse me. In palliative sedation, you're giving some controlled dose of a sedative medication. In MAID, it's a controlled dose of lethal medication. And in withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment, it's a discontinuation of said life-sustaining treatment. So the method through which you implement that treatment is different. The motivation is slightly different from these. So I think with palliative sedation and MAID, you can say that it's dignity at the end of the life. I think that can also apply to the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatment. Sometimes the motivation for these are very similar. It's maybe just the way that we act it out is a little bit different. But being able to give that person control over their suffering, I think there's no end to the list of why somebody would be motivated towards pursuing one of these treatments. Whereas with withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments, it's to kind of let maybe the disease take its course or the issue take its course. The outcome of these three is slightly different as well, right? With palliative sedation, it's reduced pain, reduced consciousness, and the prognosis can vary based on the condition that the person has. With MAID, you're it's kind of over within a short amount of time, and with the withdrawal of life-sustaining treatments, it's a natural drying process that kind of takes over and does its course. So what's really different about these three is kind of the intention, the methods, and the outcomes by a small degree. But those small degrees of difference make quite a significant impact in the way that these are understood by individuals, right? So I think being able to sort of differentiate the ethical and the moral differences that we feel. I think the first time you hear about, what's the difference really between palliative sedation and MAID? Like, listen, it's different. But they're kind of the same, but it's like a little bit different. So I think that this sort of table, this sort of exercise really helps you to elucidate the differences between things that are different in some way, but maybe have a hard time putting words to them. Right. So in that idea, let's talk about the idea of withdrawal of artificial nutrition and the idea of denying somebody food. Are they the same? Are they the different? Or like, am I asking you a trick question? Does this feel like a trick question? I don't know. Maybe there is a right answer to this one. Who knows? And I think the reason that we're talking about withdrawal of artificial nutrition and denying food is because oftentimes I believe what a lot of the concern that is raised by SDMs or by patients or by families is that if we're withdrawing nutrition, we're denying them food. And I can't deny them food. Like that's not something we can do. But maybe there is a difference. Maybe there isn't a difference. So love to see everybody's thoughts on these. Interesting. So I think we have kind of a majority saying no, they are different. Some people feeling like they're same, and some people as lost as I was the first time I came across this. Like, I don't know, it seems like a trick situations. I think this is helpful to see. And what I think is we help kind of do this exercise hopefully together. So I'll try to ask, if you guys could respond in the chat with some of the inputs that you may have on this. So we have this table, right? Intentions, methods, motivations, outcomes, and the key differences between denying food and a withdrawal of artificial nutrition. Anybody have an idea of how the intentions differ? So what is the intention, let's say, for maybe denying somebody food or for a withdrawal of artificial nutrition? We'll give it a minute to see if we get any answers here. If we have any brave souls willing to give some input
The
here.
chat is surprisingly quiet tonight. People did a great job of introducing themselves. Oh, we
Yeah,
have some things coming up here now. So, somebody talked about, and I'm not sure where it fits here, but perhaps under outcome, um, the safety issue related to um, denying food
yeah,
versus withdrawal of artificial nutrition and hydration.
yeah.
Um, Somebody just indicated that they're both very
Right.
different.
Malice
Um,
is coming up as an
you're
like,
seeing that? Okay.
yeah, right. So in terms of the intent is withdrawing to let the natural process take its course, ensuring that there's no pain. Yeah. So I think that they have a good idea of what the difference in intention is. And I think these are some great answers coming through to let somebody sort of, that doesn't have an ability to swallow, risk of choking. I think these are all some of these are motivations. But if we look at the idea of intentions, right? When we talk about denying somebody food, that comes with the implicit understanding that they're asking for food, right? That there's a want for food, and we're saying no, you can't have it. And I think that that's where the idea of malice or harm comes into play. Is that if we're doing something that is denying somebody food in this situation, where we're hurting them in some way, we're maybe potentially hastening their death. How does that differ from a withdrawal of artificial food and nutrition, which also does hasten death, kind of in the perspective of an SDM? Is that, kind of along the lines of what a lot of people have responded with, is that it allows for the natural death process to occur. It potentially is, hopefully integrated with other palliative or comfort measures and helps to alleviate some suffering that the individual might be feeling. It's out of this respect for autonomy for a person to choose that, hey, it's time for you to go, or it's time for me to go. They've made that decision, they've come to peace with it. Whereas with denying food, the intention of that action is entirely different. And some of us may have a more comfort and a knowledge on being able to elucidate that difference. But when you're faced in a clinical situation where they're like, no, you're denying food, and that there's a difference, but it becomes hard to articulate. I think that this helps you elucidate some of that. So if we think about the methods, right, how are these different in the methods through which we would implement these different things? So happy to take some answers in the chat. Right, what is the how does this differ by its method?
Go back to intention a little bit because a lot of folks mentioned, and I think
Yeah,
we've experienced this where the person, for whatever reason, has started having issues with choking. And
right.
so, the denying food, you have kind of, there's a context to that too,
Yeah,
right? And if it's for safety, that's got a different flavor than denying food from a neglect or abuse point of view. Like, I think people truly believe they're doing their best to support the person. And
Yeah.
what I find sometimes with that, then, there's risks involved. And so you have to have a conversation with the resident or the family about the risks associated with eating.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so I just saw that come up quite a bit.
No, I think that's a good point as well, right? And I think that with I think denying food in that context is a little bit different because it's about a, an understanding that we're trying to protect the safety of the individual. I think the context that I'm trying to frame this issue within is in spaces where you have families or individuals that respond negatively to the idea of a withdrawal of nutrition because they feel it is akin to starving a person, that we're denying them food. We're not giving them something that they need. And there's a difference. And I think everybody's highlighted, a lot of people have highlighted that idea in the chat that's come through. And like you said, right, it's sometimes it's for safety or it's for a different reason. But when I think it's equated with, withdrawal of artificial, food and nutrition, the denial of food is not what's happening here. Denial of food would be something that is not appropriate to maybe do. In some situations, maybe it is appropriate and it is the compassionate thing to do. And that's, I think, what ethics is a little bit about, is that, in every different context, the same thing that seems permissible in one space is impermissible in another, or it feels impermissible in another. Right. So this is the contextual awareness that we should have, or we should try to build. And I think that this exercise of creating a chart to differentiate that based on the context that we frame the issue in can help with that. So if we look at the methods through which that happens, in denying food, it's the literal withholding of food or fluids. And in some spaces or in some ways, that could involve physical restraints, that could involve some form of coercion, and it could even take space, or it could happen because of neglect. Lots of different ways that denial of food can happen. We look at a withdrawal of artificial nutrition, maybe we're talking about either discontinuing or not initiating the methods through which we provide tubing through, either through gastric spaces or intravenously. The method through which the withdrawal of artificial food and nutrition occurs is mechanically very different from the method through which you would deny somebody food. The motivation that we would have for doing these two is also very different. And I think we've highlighted that in the chat. We've had some answers that look at that. Right. Sometimes it's because we have informed decision from a patient. That's why we're withdrawing artificial nutrition. I think that's the ideal situation. When we don't have that, it's a substitute decision maker making a judgment on the wishes or the best interests of that patient. And sometimes it focuses around futility, or the idea of let's make this person comfortable, making sure that there's some form of a dignity at their end of life. Whereas when we look at something that's, the aggressive form of denying food, we feel like we know better than the patient. We know better than you. You can't have this. We're withholding this from you actively, right? And I think that the outcome that comes from these is a little bit different as well. They both lead to death in some ways, but with the withdrawal of artificial nutrition, you've been supporting them while they have some underlying illness that may be impacting them. So a withdrawal of that food and nutrition lets that process take its place. Whereas denying somebody food that's asking for it, you may be starving them, you may be dehydrating them, you may be causing them significant pain and suffering. So I think the key difference between these two ideas is one is an active form and one is a passive form of an intervention. Right. So denying food would kind of be that active form, and withdrawal of artificial nutrition would be that passive form. So hopefully this was somewhat of a helpful exercise. And I think that you could use this table for different issues that you have. So if you have two ideas that are a little bit different, that are harder for you to articulate, I think plugging them in this way and working through this table can help you understand how they're different, so that when you do face these issues or these questions in a clinical space or in a space when somebody's asking you, you have something to check back to say that, okay, well, this is how I can articulate it. I think seeing this written out in this way allows you to be like, oh yeah, obviously they're very different. Right? If we go back to the slide here about where has it gone? It's disappeared now on me. On palliative sedation versus, withdrawal of life-sustaining measures and MAID, a little bit more nuanced, right? But seeing it like this, oh yeah, it's so obvious they're so different. So I think that's the takeaway that I'm hoping everybody sees here, is that this table can help you come to those more nuanced differences in some spaces. So now that we've talked about all this, fun stuff, what is it that we can do? How can we really have an impact, and how can we help, right? And I think that there are a lot of ways to do this, and one of the ways is to clarify the role of the SDM. And this is specifically because I think a lot of the responses and anecdotally even seeing this issue come up, the SDM perspective and the SDM involvement does make it more complicated to deal with. So clarifying the role of the SDM becomes very important. So what is the role of the SDM? The SDM is there to provide consent for a treatment when a patient lacks capacity. That is their only role. Whether they're a power of attorney for personal care, or they're a partner, or they're a sibling. Doesn't matter what SDM they are. If they're an SDM, their role is to provide consent in keeping with the best interests or known wishes of the patient or resident in question. The expectation is that they act as the patient would have acted if the patient was capable. Right, so we're assuming that we're talking about situations where patient lacks capacity. If a patient has capacity, the SDM is welcome to be involved if that's what the patient or the resident wants. But their wishes are not ones that we have a moral or legal obligation to uphold. SDMs can't demand treatment that is contraindicated. And I think that this is a big point that sometimes we struggle with, or where we're unsure about, because, well, the SDM asked for it, so we have to do it, just like if the patient would have asked for it, right? And that's not necessarily true. Just like if a patient asks for something that isn't a reasonable treatment, it's hard to justify why you would have to provide it, right? So if they're asking, if they're like, people can request anything that they want. They can request all the treatment in the world, but they don't necessarily have a right to receive that treatment, especially if it's contraindicated, or if there's no therapeutic benefit, or if it is not something that you would do within the standard of care for this individual. And I think there's a procedural way to handle SDM conflicts. We'll touch on that a little bit later, but basically what happens is that depending on the sort of conflict that you have, you would either go to the Office of the Public Guardian and Trustee, or you would seek help from the Consent and Capacity Board. Now, again, those are both kind of last stage, actions. Before that, you try to have a family conversation, give a call to your favorite ethicist. Hopefully that's me. Try to involve allied health support to work through these conversations so you can provide these individuals support through this. But there is, I think, a procedural method to which to do this, and it ends up with either being a call to the public guardian and trustee, especially if you find yourself in Ontario, or an appeal to the Consent Capacity Board, which is also a legislatively Ontario thing to follow. Another thing that I think we can do in these spaces is focus on the prognosis and what therapeutic options are really present. So what is the medical prognosis of this patient? Is their quality of life likely to improve, stay the same with treatment, or is it likely to decline because of that treatment? And your answer to that question speaks to this idea of futility, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides. But how do you differentiate that? What is really treatment? Is it indicated? Is it necessary for this person to have food and nutrition provided to them artificially? What is the person's quality of life going to be? And more importantly, does that align with their wishes? Because they may have a poor quality of life, and be something they would have wanted for themselves, right? Some individuals feel that, hey, it's okay if I'm suffering at the end of my life. I am okay with that. I have come to terms with that might be a reality for me. And if that is a reality for me, I am okay with that. You might not feel that way, and that's okay. That shouldn't matter. What does the patient or the resident that we're providing care to want for themselves? And that's a difficult question to answer, and there's a lot of ambiguity around it sometimes. And I think that's the challenge in medicine. That's the challenge that we have to face as healthcare providers. It's not going to always be an easy process, but if we're trying to focus on those questions, if we try to ask family members, well, what would they have wanted? Have you had a conversation about this? Have they stated their wishes about this? Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. Maybe it was an offhand conversation you had one time. How can you elucidate that information when the patient lacks the capacity or ability to communicate that to you? And that speaks in the next point, which is, what does a patient want for themselves? Right. And I think that if nothing else, this is the most important question. What does the patient want for themselves? We assume a lot of the times at the end of the life, person loses capacity. Maybe they have dementia on top of all of the other issues. They can't know what they want. Maybe they can. Have we tried involving them in the conversation? How many times have you seen or been a part of a circle of care where you're all having a conversation about what's the best for this patient, what can we provide them, and the patient is not part of that conversation? It does happen, and not out of malice, but just out of sometimes procedure. It's just the way things happen. It's just the way we behave because of the timelines we work with, the high patient loads that we have, the number of people that we have to provide care for, make it difficult to always create this space where we're involving that person. But if we're asking the question, what does the patient want for themselves? What is in their best interest? We should be trying to involve them as much as we can because, again, capacity is time and decision specific. So while, you might be absolutely right, this person with dementia can't make a judgment about whether or not they can change the dosage of their heart medication because they may not be able to understand and appreciate, yeah, you're not having heart problems right now, but that's because of the medication you're taking. Versus a question of, well, does this person want to eat? Does this person want this type of food? Does this person want this artificial nutrition? Tube pulling is a very real issue that happens with a lot of people that have artificial nutrition. Why are they pulling the tubes? Is it because it's uncomfortable? What is the issue there? They are able to communicate to you their needs, even if they can't communicate to you every need. Right. So another thing to look at and focus on is, what are the benefits of artificial nutrition? Do they outweigh the negative impacts that might have on that person? In some cases they do, in some cases they don't, right? And it goes back to that earlier question we talked about, what is ethical? Is it the benefit of the action or is it the rule following? Based on the situation that you're in, it may be one or the other, maybe neither. But I think there's a duty to sort of explore that as much as we can because it helps us gain clarity on how we can potentially propose a recommendation of how to act in this particular case or in this particular situation. Right? We're never going to have a perfect answer to everything. But I think by focusing on some of these, it allows us to understand what's the best thing we can do in this particular space. I think another thing that we can do is educate and demystify, right? And going back to what you mentioned earlier, around the introduction of the presentation, is that educate and demystify isn't something that applies just to patients and their families. It applies to us as healthcare providers as well. Right. So it's important for us to be educated on how to have these conversations well. And I think today we've talked about some of the ethical dilemmas, some of the value laden concepts, but how do you have this conversation at the bedside? What words do you use? How do you communicate with them? Those are things that we still all need to, I think, work on. Right. Those aren't skills that you may take away from this conversation or from this education session. But you should be empowered, and there's a few resources that I'm hopefully looking forward to share at the end of the presentation that you could look to, but I'm sure there's lots of other resources out there that can help you to understand how do you have an educated conversation about some of these topics. Right. And I think from the patient perspective is to be able to educate them and help them demystify the misconceptions they may have about something like denying food in artificial nutrition. To us, it may be very obvious as healthcare providers that have been in the space for a very long time that these are two very distinct and very different things, but not for the patients and not for the families necessarily, right? So they may need to be explained. It's different because of the intention. It's different because of the motivation. It's different because of the outcome. How is it different? So help them to understand that may not make it easier to have, may not magically resolve the issue, but it may make the conversation easier to have. Right? And I think going back to something we're mentioning on, previous few slides, when is something treatment versus when is it futile? I think having that conversation is also really important, something that can help you navigate some of these difficult food and nutrition discussions near the end of an individual's life. If we look at the CPSO definition of treatment, defines it as anything that is done for therapeutic, preventative, palliative, diagnostic, cosmetic, or other health-related purposes. Right? So it's something that has some form of an impact. If a treatment or an intervention no longer has the impact that it was meant to have, is it still treatment? And I think this is a very, very important question to ask in the space of artificial food and nutrition, because oftentimes when it is presented, it is treatment. It is something that will help this person. But then there comes a time in that, that patient's journey when it's lost its impact. It's no longer providing them a therapeutic benefit. Maybe their other underlying conditions have in some way progressed to a place where there's not much more we can do. And now food and nutrition is no longer treatment. It's something that's just simply prolonging their consciousness. Right? So is the intervention improving, reversing, or maintaining a person's condition? I think if you can answer yes, then it's most likely considered to be treatment. But if it's the answer is no, then is it really treatment? And futility is a very, I think, value-laden concept for patient families and providers. It's difficult to have this conversation. So it's also important to understand who is determining that this is futile or not, right? So if we go back to that idea of the patient who's accepting chemo treatment, even though it's not with curative intent, to that person, yeah, well, technically by definition, maybe that is futile treatment. But for that person, it's giving them some benefit. It's allowing them some positive outcome. So a perspective of which you're looking at futility also then matters, right? It's not an objective standpoint all the time. Right. And the things that you would consider in that, what are the benefits? What are the standards of care? And who is determining those risks and benefits is an important question to ask as well. Right. So again, nothing is really a monolith. It should be looked at contextually and case by case in order to understand what might be the best approach in a particular space. All right. So from all of this, a few things to remember. Patients, families, whomever you're talking with, they have a right to deny consent. Right? They can say no, and that can be appropriate. Right? So just because they're disagreeing with what you and I might believe is the best thing to do in this situation, it doesn't always matter. It's important. It has a huge impact on that care, but they have a right to deny consent to these treatments, keeping in mind that they're acting in the best interest, that it is a coercion-free decision. They have a right to deny that. Just because somebody is saying something that you don't like doesn't mean that they're wrong. Right. So I think all of the points that we talked about today, using those to elucidate why somebody's doing something will help you to understand whether or not that's a choice that is appropriate to let move forward. And sometimes when you're doing your best, it's not enough. And that's not your fault. You could do everything right in a particular situation, but it's just the reality of some of these issues is just that you can't do more. You just can't solve it all. Right. And like with anything else, especially issues at the end of life, I mean, not a newsflash, it's a very difficult time. It's probably the worst time in that person's life and that family's life. So they may not be as rational as we might be because we may be more accustomed to seeing this, or we have a little bit of a separation. We may have a lot of compassion and you may hurt with them, but it's not happening to you. So you may not feel the same emotional burden. And that's not a bad thing, but that's just a reality of the situation. And I think at the very end of it all is your obligation is to care for your patient or for your resident. It's not to care for the family. You respect the family, but just because the family's asking for something doesn't mean that they get it, especially if it's contraindicated, if it doesn't have a therapeutic benefit for the individual, right? So all of the things that we talked about focused on, is it right for the patient? And if it's right for the patient, then it's great. But just because the SDM said this, just because the power of attorney for personal care wanted this, is not reason enough to move forward, right? So in some
Can I
situations,
can I
yeah,
interrupt just because there's a couple of comments and questions that have
yeah,
come up in the chat about consent. So do you mind just taking a little bit of a detour because I know I've already heard you talk about consent.
yeah,
Just give a, quick primer on what consent is in the context of healthcare decision making.
for sure. I think there's 6 words I can give you for defining consent. It is the ability to understand and the ability to appreciate. So those 6 words define consent pretty holistically in the healthcare space. So does a patient or the individual providing consent have the ability to understand what they're providing or denying consent for? Right. So do they know the treatment that you're proposing? Do they understand it? And do they have the ability to appreciate what it means to accept that as treatment or to deny that as treatment? And what does it mean to appreciate something is, do you understand the impact that it is going to have on your life? Do you understand the impact that it will have if you accept it, if you say yes and provide the consent? And do you understand what it will impact you if you say no? If a person is able to articulate to you that they understand and that they appreciate, so understand and appreciate, you can be more confident that this person has demonstrated to you that they have consent. Now, consent should be understood, you know, innocent until proven guilty, same thing, capable until proven otherwise. Right? A person should be assumed to have a capacity um, to consent. So that is the idea of capacity means in relation to consent. Now, consent is the actual process of gaining somebody's permission to move forward with a proposed treatment. Is that
I think that's good.
that's good? Perfect. Any other
Thanks.
follow-up questions? Happy to take them.
Okay. Sounds good.
Yeah. One thing I do want to mention on that point actually is, so there's this understanding that we've come to see a lot, is that, oh yeah, this person doesn't have a capacity assessment, so we don't know. The duty to assess somebody's capacity and their ability to consent is the responsibility of the person that is proposing the treatment. So, yeah, neuropsych came in and gave you this input, great. Maybe you have that resource, maybe you don't. Nobody else is responsible for, or rather should be responsible for, determining the consent of an individual other than the person that is suggesting the treatment. And I think that, that follows quite logically. If I'm a physician and I have a patient and I'm proposing a treatment, it's my job to make sure that that person has consent or has capacity to consent. Right. If I need help from neuropsych to come in and provide a capacity assessment and help me with that, they can do that and it can be helpful. But the onus is on the MRP to elucidate that difference. All right. So in situations, going back to kind of nutrition at the end of life and difficulties that we may have with SDMs, if situations are finding themselves to be, a little bit difficult or stressful in some way, hope that you would turn to allied health partners to help you with some of those issues. So that might look like somebody on your team that has more experience, um, resources like social work if you have those available, ethics if you have access to that through your organizations. If you're in the Ottawa region, we're most likely the Champlain Center is your contact for that, and we maybe do provide services for ethics for you. You reach out to your managers to confirm if you feel like you don't or don't know. My email is going to be on the last slide, so feel free to reach out and we can find out, if we're the ones that provide that support or who might be your ethical contact. But then offering support to the patient, the family, or the SDM is going to also be really important. So that looks like family meetings to allow really everybody to come together and have a conversation. The number of family meetings I've been a part of, and just having everybody in one room means so much to patients and to families to work through those discussions. They say, okay, you know what? This is all we wanted was everybody in this one room so we could all get everything out in the open because I'm dealing with a home care provider and then I'm dealing with this physician. And then we had this one attending who was on for 1 week in the hospital. And then there was another, so they don't know who's part. It becomes very, very difficult to have some of those spaces and those conversations in those spaces. So having that supportive team meeting can really often help just alleviate some of those concerns. Spiritual care, I think, especially in the space of nutrition, dietitians can be a good resource to reach out to as well if you have those supports in your organization. And like we alluded to earlier, if it gets to that point where the situation is kind of polarized and it's really not working, an application to the consent and capacity board might be appropriate. Again, that's not going to be the first line of defense or treatment for these complicated situations, but it's something that you can approach, especially if you're providing care in Ontario. It's one of the resources that help to work through this space. So kind of coming near kind of the end of the presentation, I do have a case study I think would be interesting for us to kind of visit together, but happy to also open it up to the audience for questions. What do you think, Val? How should we?
It's always good. I think the more examples folks can have, there's a couple of things in the chat, but hopefully we'll have time to capture those as well.
Sure. So maybe we'll start with the situation that we were looking at earlier, right? The situation with Jim. After that deeper discussion, you agree to transition Jim to palliative care approach, but you have a difficult time deciding if you should withdraw his nutrition. So how do we kind of approach this? And I think through the presentation that we've gone through so far, I think the first step would be to consider whether or not artificial nutrition is treatment still for this person, right? Is this still going to have a therapeutic benefit for Jim? Once we've elucidated that, we can look at trying to see and respect the patient perspective. What does Jim want for themselves? What does he want as the care that he's receiving? Explore what options the patient does have, wanting something versus it being a reasonable treatment may not be in the cards. Sometimes you see patients who want to go home and also receive artificial nutrition through the tubes that they may already have, but suctioning is a huge concern sometimes. The upkeep of that is not necessarily easy to do at home, so maybe that's not an option you have, right? Even though that's what the patient's perspective is. So explore what options the patient has is important. Correcting misconceptions and educating where needed. And utilizing your allied health resources to make sure that you have a holistic team approach in the space will often really help. And then, of course, escalate procedurally as necessary. So if these strategies and these steps aren't working to deal with having this discussion for you and for the team and for the care team or the circle of care at large, then you kind of follow those procedures as needed. So hopefully that's helpful. I have another situation. This is the situation of Mr. Vance. So Mr. Vance is a 92-year-old resident of a long-term care facility. He has a history of several strokes, which have resulted in significant dysphagia, so difficulty swallowing. His care plan specifies a pureed diet and thickened liquids to minimize the risk of aspiration. Staff are trained to provide assisted feeding with these precautions in place. Mr. Vance also has moderate cognitive impairment, making it difficult for him to fully participate in the feeding process or communicate his needs effectively. Mr. Vance's partner Phyllis visits frequently, often during mealtimes. Phyllis is very concerned about her husband's weight loss and believes that the pureed diet is not providing adequate nutrition. Despite being advised by the nursing staff about the risks of aspiration, she often brings in outside foods that are not part of the prescribed diet, so solid foods, home cooked meals, things like that. She insists on feeding her husband herself, even when the staff express a concern. So the nursing staff has observed Phyllis feeding Mr. Vance too quickly, using a spoon to push food into his mouth and not allowing sufficient time for swallowing. On several occasions, Mr. Vance has coughed, choked, and has had episodes of respiratory distress during or after these feeding sessions, and staff have had to intervene to ensure Ms. Vance's safety. So I'm sure some of you might be like, I dealt with this yesterday, or this happens all the time. I think that this is a very common issue that we hear about and see. So would love to see in the chat if anybody has any ideas about what some of the concerns are here. What should the staff do in this situation, or what can the staff do? Yeah. So we have some ideas, some answers coming in here. I think we have, concerns about Mr. Vance's safety. That is a huge concern. Somebody's mentioned to involve the dietitian, right? Is the spouse being non-compliant due to forms of denial, choking risks, more health teachings with Phyllis, educating and demystifying some of this would definitely help. Offer to puree the food that she's bringing in. All right, if the idea is, you feel like the nutrition that we're giving her isn't enough and you want to bring outside food and we have the ability to puree that, let's look into that. I think it's a great offer. That's a great way to deal with some of this. Risks of aspiration pneumonia are huge. Definitely could create a problematic situation for Mr. Vance here. I think a lot of the answers here revolve around educating the individual about what the best approach is. I think that these are all great answers. Yeah. So again, going back to this table, hopefully is a way to elucidate the differences about what's happening here. So Miss Phyllis feeding Mr. Vance. What is the intention here? The intention is to nourish and nurture her partner and ensure that he gets enough food to prevent further weight loss. Right? I think that's one of the intentions that Phyllis can be coming into the situation with. The method that she's doing that with, or doing that through, is by bringing in outside food, feeding too quickly, and not allowing Mr. Vance to swallow in an appropriate amount of time. What is she motivated by? I think concerns about weight loss, that might be to her very scary that, oh no, he's losing a lot of weight. Does that mean he's nearing the end of his life? Maybe she's not ready to let go, right? A belief that the prescribed diet that long-term care is offering Mr. Vance isn't adequate, or just a desire to care for somebody that she loves, right? Different motivations for why she may be behaving this way. And the outcome of that, or the outcome of all of this, is that it's creating episodes of coughing, choking, and respiratory distress for Mr. Vance and increasing his risk of aspiration pneumonia. Right. So I think that the benefit of this table in this situation is when you're faced with a situation that's, maybe a little bit complex, seeing it written out on a slide, a lot easier than when you're, at the bedside or in a clinical space and dealing with the situation. But I think by breaking down the case into this different sort of, step-by-step thing helps us to see it from a more objective standpoint and allows us to better think about what are the things that we can address that are present here that might help this situation positively. And I think that people highlighted that quite well in the chat box here. But mentioning that if we're seeing that her motivation is to provide comfort and care for Mr. Vance, maybe there's an opportunity to have a conversation with her about, hey, you're trying to do something that's going to help him and make him comfortable, but it's genuinely causing him harm and distress, right? If her motivation is to make sure that her husband is calm, collected, and comfortable, that maybe offers you an opportunity to say that, hey, maybe instead of focusing on feeding, we can find you some ways that you can spend quality time with this individual where they're more calm, where they're taken care of. Let's take the focus off of the feeding, right? But you only know that is something that is worthwhile to explore as an option if you've understood their motivation is to provide comfort and care. If the motivation is something different, then that might motivate you to provide a different option about how to deal with that situation. So I think that this table breaks the intentions, method, motivation, and outcome down, helps us to make complicated situations a little bit easier to see the differences in, and then provide some of the great responses I think we've seen come through the chat here. And I think with that, we're really at the end here. There are a few resources I just wanted to highlight that I think impact the discussion that we're talking about. So the Health Consent Act talks a lot about the substitute decision makers' rights, responsibilities, and hierarchy. The Consent Capacity Board, the link there leads you to the website, which details, ways that you can contact them and reach out to them. I came across this great end of life nutrition blog post from which that there was a graphic a few slides ago that I had, with different numbers about how to have some of these conversations really at the bedside. I think in today's presentation, we looked more about, a little over hierarchical sort of abstract view of the ethics and how do you have some of those conversations from a higher level. But this is a really good method that talks about how do you have some of those conversations? What are the words that you should use in those spaces and can be helpful? And that last link there is for an NHS presentations with some strategies on how to approach these conversations in a more clinical setting. Yeah, there are neighbors across the pond, and I think that they have a very interesting approach. But again, the procedures or ways to interact with things, a lot to learn from, I think, there as well. So happy to turn it over to the group if you have any questions. Happy to try to address those. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ali. That's awesome. I think one of the themes that came up a little bit in the chat was around, and I think you addressed it, and just correct my understanding. So folks are asking about, what if the family or the resident themselves wants something that really isn't clinically indicated, but they
Mhm.
want it? Like,
Yeah.
there's no responsibility of the healthcare provider to provide that treatment,
Mhm.
correct?
Yeah, I think, the when a individual's requesting care, they're asking for something that they feel is going to help them. And as a care provider, what is our duty? It's to provide an individual with care that is appropriate to their needs. So a family may come in asking you, give us this intervention. They may come in with the best intentions. They may have done their own research, diligently through whatever means, but they may not know what is the contextual relevancy of that treatment and of that intervention. And just because that person is asking, you're right, Val, doesn't mean that they're entitled to receive it. What I think, is an appropriate and courteous thing to do is to listen to that input, be like, oh, that's what you want as treatment, right? Not to dismiss them right away, because what they might be bringing to the table could be very valid. It may be something that you missed, right? That does happen. We do make mistakes, or we do overlook certain things. So just because it's coming from the patient perspective or the family perspective, or maybe they saw it on Google or read it on Reddit somewhere, doesn't mean that it may not, like, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have validity. You know, sure, more times than not, it doesn't. But to treat every situation like, oh yeah, you're asking for this, we're not really gonna entertain that, I think is not a appropriate way to approach those conversations, right? So it's, yeah, you don't have a duty to provide it, but only if it's really not indicated, right? The duty that we might have out of compassion is to listen to them, to understand, like, okay, this is what you're asking, this is why you're asking it, instead of me just saying no, maybe I can provide you with a different alternative, right? So if you're asking for this treatment and this intervention because you understand the outcome will be something, maybe I can demystify for you why that would be the outcome, or why I don't see that as the outcome, right? So I think it's, yeah, we don't have a duty to provide an individual an intervention just because they asked for it. But that doesn't mean that we necessarily just approach that conversation to say, no, thank you, next, right? That's about, gives you an opportunity to have hopefully a constructive discussion with them about what their treatment options might be and what is realistic for them to expect.
What this question might be a bit more for a clinician, but as somebody asked you to reflect on how to know when to keep going and when to stop encouraging patients to keep eating, especially in a situation of dementia. So I think a lot of healthcare providers, either from their own values and beliefs or maybe pressure that they're getting from team members or family members, like they're trying to assist the resident with their nutrition, but the resident is closing their mouth or chomping down on the fork or the spoon or, you know, having responsive behaviors when they try to have assistance with nutrition. So, you know, how as a clinician do you know when to keep going, when to stop? How, like, what's how to proceed?
I think that's a great question, and um, I think we as ethicists get sometimes a bad rap because we often answer with, "Well, it depends." I mean, and I think it really does because it's the context of the space that you're in, and it's your own comfort level about, where because what happens in that situation is you're the individual that has to, sometimes maybe live with the guilt of not doing the right thing. If that's what you perceive that, the answer to that to be like, well, if I don't try this many times, then I haven't done the right thing. But if the family's asking you to provide, please encourage my family member to eat. I think it's a personal call, but what makes you comfortable, right? When you're interacting with that patient, if their responsive behaviors are very aggressive and they're always very just like, I don't want anything, and they're, describing what you said, Mel, then maybe you try fewer times versus if the individual's having, not as aggressive responsive behaviors where they're just like, turning away or they're behaving in a particular way, then you might try, 3, 4, 5 times. Right, so I think it really depends on the way that the individual that you're trying to feed is communicating to you,
Mm.
and I think that that would be something that you could gauge where to set your tone on. It's difficult to provide, a concrete number or an answer, but this is the right point, and that's where the judgment that you have as a clinician or a person providing frontline care comes in, and absolutely, you should have the confidence in yourself to say that, "Hey, I tried this many number of times. That's all that was reasonable for me to do. And that's all that's appropriate for me to try." And you shouldn't live with the guilt from that. Like, "Oh, I could have tried one more time." You know, maybe you could have, but was it reasonable? Did you have another 8 residents to take care of? Probably, right? Is that person rejecting nutrition for what reason? It's hard to ascertain, right? So it's I think there's a lot of moral guilt that we live with when we feel like we've let down a patient or their family. And that's something that, we need strategies to manage, right? We talk about how to deal with moral distress, and we've had some rounds presentations on that. But I think focusing on dealing with your moral distress becomes an important part in answering some of these questions because there comes a point where it's like, not reasonable to keep trying, but you still need to deal with the impact that that has on you.
Yeah, and I mean through your whole talk, Ali, I've been thinking about how important it is for people who are providing support to residents and their families around nutrition at the end of life, how important it is for them to do their own reflection about what do they bring to the table and what are they comfortable with. Um, like you almost need, the last table you showed, you need like Val's thoughts on this, right? Not just Phyllis, but myself as as a healthcare provider. What do I bring to this table, and what do I see as intention and motivation and
Yeah.
outcome? Yeah. Um, just some folks talking about, some examples of long-term care, like how the cues you can see, like chewing a straw, spitting out food, turning their head, clenching their teeth. Like, although we perceive somebody with dementia doesn't have much agency, they can express themselves pretty well, a lot of times.
And I think
Um,
capacity becomes, when we talk about it being time and decision specific is really important to understand. Because, that individual with dementia probably doesn't have the ability to understand and appreciate all the other medications and all the other interventions that they may be being provided with how they impact them. But something like eating, something like pain, are you in pain? Yeah, I'm in pain. Do you want medication for that pain? Yes, I would like medication to make this pain stop. Arguably, it's probably enough consent, right? I think in the line of that, somebody's asked here, a resident with dementia who only wanted to eat cookies. Cookies are amazing. I love cookies. I wish I could have a cookie only diet. I know my, you know, mom would probably be very upset. She's like, you're old now, you're living on your own. You're just gonna have cookies now. I knew this day would come, right? It's probably her worst nightmare. But why is an individual that has dementia not allowed to make that choice for themselves? It's probably not great. They're not getting good nutrition. The family wanting them to eat healthier, very valid want for them to have. But do they have the right to come into that space and say that no, don't do it in this way, do it in this other way? Does that person not have the capacity to say, I want a cookie now? Can I please have a cookie? Why are you saying no?
Mm.
It's difficult. I think it's very hard to have that conversation with family. Be like, well, they wanted a cookie. We had a cookie. We gave them a cookie. And they wanted more cookies. We gave them more cookies. Like, were we going to deny them cookies because they're requesting, they're expressing a need, they're expressing a want, right? I feel like there comes a point where it's like, okay, you're having too many cookies, and this is bad for you and your health, and it's going to impact your blood sugar and have a whole host of other problems. I think if it's getting to that point, then you're saying no to the cookies because you have a reason to say no, because this is you no longer are able to understand the impact that it's having on your health. But if the person just wants cookies often and a lot, and it's not harming them significantly.
It goes back to the goals of care, right? And somebody talked about comfort nutrition, right? It's nutrition that's going to promote comfort for the resident.
Yeah.
Um, I think that's a really good way to look at it.
And I think Kathy also mentioned something here is that, nonverbal communication is a very valid form of communication, especially with individuals that have altered cognition, as well as the idea of you can make healthier cookies. And if the person really likes cookies, maybe there's ways to sneak, some nutrition
Zucchini.
in zucchini cookies. I mean, with some chocolate, I'm sure that the person would still, maybe prefer that over, a straight zucchini. So I think that it's sometimes about of like, creative ways to meet a person where they're at and provide them care in a way that they're going to be happy and comfortable to receive.
Well, that was excellent, Allie. And, I just want to recognize you worked really hard on this. We sent you pages and pages of feedback from the participants. So this is kind of the end of our three-part series on nutrition at the end of life in long-term care. And we had Emily, a dietitian, present, and we had a nurse practitioner, Melanie, present. And at the end of each of those sessions, you know, we asked participants to identify issues that they'd like you to address. And I think you did a really amazing job of doing that. And so we're really appreciative of your work and your gentle, down to earth approach in sharing what can be sometimes pretty difficult information, but the way you present is makes it really understandable and easy to take in. So on behalf of everybody, we want to thank you so very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the kind words. And I hope this was helpful. And I urge, everybody else that's hearing the presentation, keep engaging with these topics. I think, hopefully there's some takeaways that were helpful for you. And especially if you're somebody that's, within the Champlain region, we might be the part of your ethics service. So if you haven't reached out before, or you're unsure, please feel free to reach out. And if you want to establish connect or a point of connect, we're happy to do that as well.